Number 1.
When I was about 13, my parents and I moved to an old house. It was at least 90 years old. It was large and was in pretty good condition for a house that old. I was an only child, and I got the second biggest room on the second floor, and that room was huge. Sometimes my parents would leave me at home by myself for a few hours if they were going shopping or on a date. I didn't mind staying at home because I like to think of myself as responsible and trustworthy. It made me feel special. One night at around 6 p.m., my parents had gone to run some errands. They were the kind of people who spent hours out shopping for the best deals. They used a lot of coupons on whatever they could, and I did not want to be involved in this at all, so I decided not to go with them. I stayed in my room to watch some TV. Then at around 8 p.m., I got hungry and decided to get a snack. Now by this time, the house is very dark, so I grabbed my cell phone and used it as best as I could to light up the hallway, since the hallway didn't have a light. Now this was before cell phones had built-in flashlights, so I just used all the light my screen could give, until I made it to the kitchen. The kitchen light had been left on by my parents. I then set my phone on the counter, and then began walking towards the pantry. As I was walking to the pantry, I saw a man hunched down in the corner, by the back door. He was wearing black and red clothing, and he had long, greasy, unkempt hair. I didn't see his face because his head was facing the wall. He was holding a large knife. He didn't notice that I had spotted him. I wanted to scream, but I used my hand to cover my mouth, and I walked back upstairs, leaving my cell phone down there, as I was not walking back over to get it. We didn't have any phones upstairs, so I walked into my room, locked my door, and hid in the closet. I started crying silently and started thinking the worst. He was going to find me and kill me. I just knew it. Then I heard someone coming up the stairs. Heavy footsteps. I felt sick. I had never been so afraid in my life. I then heard someone open the door to my parents' room, which was 2 rooms away from mine. The footsteps then started coming towards my room. I started to panic. I then heard police sirens outside and knocking on the front door. I breathe a sigh of relief. I then hear the man quickly running back downstairs and hear him trying to open our back door. I then hear our front door being pushed down, and I heard the footsteps of 2 people coming up the stairs. I assumed they were police officers searching our home. They knocked on my door to let me know it's safe. I then opened the door. I later found out that our neighbors saw this man unlocking our back door with a key and saw that he had a knife and called the police. My parents arrived a few minutes later, and my mom started hugging me and crying. The man, unfortunately, escaped. I got no sleep that night because the man had a key. We had to change all our locks, but we eventually moved out of state. I'm 23 now, and I have moved past it, but there are still several questions I have. How did he get a key to our house? Why did he want to come inside? And what would he have done if the police showed up any later?
Number 2.
So this happened probably 3 years ago. My dad is a dentist in a small town. He has his share of nutty patients, but this has to be the scariest thing that's ever happened to our family. My entire family assists my father with the practice. My mom works on cleaning the rooms and sterilizing the instruments. My brother, when he's not in nursing school, irons the uniforms. My other brother and myself help my mom and another employee clean the office up at night. One Thursday night around 5, after the staff had pretty much left for the night, my dad was in his office filling out some charts. Mom was cleaning out the last exam room. My one brother was hanging up the uniforms, and myself, my other brother, and our employee, we'll call him John, were mopping and vacuuming. When I heard the phone ringing, there's a voicemail that picks up after a few rings. I'm listening as I'm mopping, and I hear this weird voice talking. This man was talking about how he was the tooth fairy and he's got lots of teeth for my dad. We laugh it off and my mom deletes it, chalking it up to some nutjob patient. An hour later we were wrapping things up and we hear a bang at the door. I go over to the door and yell, "Sorry, we're closed." Nothing happens. I open the mail slot and there's a guy, skinny, stringy blonde hair, yellow teeth, and staring right at me. I close it and immediately go tell my parents, and Dad calls the non-emergency police number. Our town is really small, so my dad knows most of the cops on the force. One of his patients is the dispatcher and tells him that she has an officer coming out right away. Meanwhile, my brother is peeking out of the window and says the guy has a bag. We're all freaking out and wondering what the hell he has in his bag. A cop pulls up about 5 minutes later and he starts talking to the guy. He ended up taking him in. The thing that freaked us out the most is when we found out what was in his bag. It was a bunch of teeth. Children's teeth. We never found out why he had them, or why he was trying to give them to my dad. Recently my dad retired after 39 years, and he still talks about this story, and about how it's the craziest thing that's ever happened to us.
Number 3.
So this happened to me 2 years ago. It was my first month on the job, and I work night security at this pretty interesting place. For the record, I still work there, and I have more strange stories possibly to tell in the future. I'm a 38-year-old male, and I've worked security jobs most of my life, and the graveyard shift. I was an event security guard for various well-known concert venues for years, so I've seen my fair share of strange things and crazy people. In other words, I don't scare easily, and hardly ever go into panic mode when a crisis comes up. The place I currently work at is a resort-style apartment complex. To get a better idea of the layout, there are 3 floors with 50 apartments on each floor. This place takes up one city block with a golf course in back, indoor swimming pools, hot tubs, and a small movie theater. You name it, this place has it. Most of the residents are retired doctors, lawyers, and otherwise rich. There are some younger people that live here as well, stockbrokers and real estate agents and so on. Some just use their apartment in the summer and leave as soon as the snow falls. It's located in a well-known tourist town in the United States. The building itself has 12 exits on the first floor. The doors are locked at 11 p.m. You can exit, but you can't get back in unless you go to the front of the building and ask to be buzzed in, or pick up the call box phone next to whatever exit you're at. The front lobby is set up much like a hotel, with sliding glass doors which I lock when I start my shift. In the middle of the building on the first floor, there are 2 big slider doors which I also lock. They lead to a private parking lot. The parking lot itself is gated, and you need a code to get in. This was midsummer, and while it's never really hot here, tonight was the exception. It was still very warm after the sun had set. I came in 10 minutes to 11 to start my shift. We have a routine to hand off the keys, event log, and phone to the next person on duty. Despite its size, I am the only security person here at night. My coworker who was leaving told me that the side iron gates that lead to the parking lot are open on one side because they are stuck. This is nothing new, and they often do get jammed. She told me that the repair people would be in sometime tomorrow to fix them, but just to do some extra patrols out there at night. This place sits across the road from a public park, and while the area is pretty decent, the park tends to breed druggies and homeless people at night who sometimes like to try and wander on the property or cause trouble. My night started out as uneventful. As a security guard in this place, we only have pepper spray, a large flashlight, keys, and a company cell phone to call 911 if need be. We are not to confront with bodily harm, nor can we detain anyone. We are simply eyes and ears, and to call the police if something comes up. Of course you can defend yourself if you need to, but in all cases if you're in danger, calling the police is company policy. Basically I am to walk the grounds and floors for anyone suspicious, watch the cameras in the security office which is in the lobby, and otherwise try to stay alert. If a resident calls for a maintenance request, I would take down the information in the computer for the day shift. Or if a resident called with a security issue, I would attend to it. Pretty easy enough job, I thought. I locked the doors to the parking lot and the lobby doors. I did a sweep of all the floors and then found myself back at the desk. It was really quiet, and it rolled around to 3 a.m., and I just sat down to eat my lunch when the company cell phone rang. The caller ID let me know that it was from outside one of our call boxes. I picked it up and said, "Thanks for calling. This is Security Officer James. How can I help you?" I glanced at the cameras and could see the shadow of a figure standing just out of reach from the door and the view of the camera. All I could see is the open call box and the metal cord from the phone. I again asked how could I help. The man started to breathe even heavier, and then he laughed. Then silence. It was one of those laughs you hear in a movie when the lunatic is about to do something terrible. I got up from my chair and started to walk out of the office and to the door he was at when it rang again. This time from call box number 2, which was further down. I quickly looked at the camera and saw this large figure in a hooded jacket. I knew this was strange, as it was very warm outside. He was holding a black bag in his hands, but he had his back to the camera.
"I'm coming for you, and you're gonna die,"
this voice said in a raspy, deep tone. He hung up before I had the chance to say anything. Then the phone rang again. This time I picked up, and before he could speak, I let him know the cops were on their way and to leave the property now, as he is on camera. He tried the doors, and both were locked. This time he was at yet another call box. This guy had to be running at top speed to make it to the next call box, as they were a good distance between the doors on the outside.
"I can see you. Are you ready to die? The cops won't make it here in time,"
the guy said. I spoke loud and pretended like I was talking to another security guard and asked him to send 3 other security guards to such and such location and that the police were dispatched. The guy slammed the phone down loud against the call box receiver, and I watched him on camera take off into the darkness towards the park area. I figured I had scared him off. I was going to call the police, but honestly with the location of this place it would have took them at least 15 minutes to get here. And I figured this guy was just some tweaker from the park. I scanned the cameras and patrolled the back lot just to be sure no one was there. I had my pepper spray in my hands just in case, but no one was out there. I returned to my desk and I wrote what happened in the incident log. About a half hour had passed. I had finished my lunch and was just about to do my rounds when I heard the phone ringing again. This time it was from an unknown number. I thought it would be a resident calling for a repair issue or something. I picked it up and said my normal line.
"Where are the cops? I don't see them, but I see you,"
the voice said. Fuck, it was that guy again. I scanned the cameras and did not see anything. I went to the front door to look out, and there was nothing but darkness and a few floodlights on.
"I know you're alone, and you're going to die soon,"
he said. I basically told him to get fucked and hung up. I called the non-emergency number to the police and let them know what was going on. The dispatcher said she would send a car out to check the area and make contact with me. The next thing I hear is a loud thud against the glass window to the day manager's office, which sits across from the security room. Another 3 loud bangs. I run to the door and unlock it. I pull up the shades and shine my flashlight through the window into the darkness. I catch the face of this hooded man. He looked to be about 40, with long stringy hair and these wild eyes. He looked right at me and grinned before slamming his head into the window again, trying to break it. I started yelling at him and told him that the cops were coming and he needs to get the fuck out of here. That's when he pulled the biggest damn butcher knife I've ever seen and made a slicing motion like he would use it to cut my throat. This guy was crazy and probably on drugs. He continued slamming his body against the glass, trying to break it. He used his head to try to break the window, but managed to bust his head open. So the window now has blood all over it. I backed out of the office and locked the door. I then decided to wait for the cops, as this guy was out of control and my pepper spray wasn't going to stop him. And the last thing I wanted was to handle a bloody crazy person. He then ran to the nearest side door and took the call box phone off the hook. He then ran to each call box and removed all the phones, which caused my company cell phone to ring and jam up the line. This guy had to be on meth or something, because he ran as fast as I could imagine. I watched the camera and noticed to my horror, the sliding glass door on the garage was open. Now, it was common for residents to get out of their cars and unlock the door themselves. It's just a sliding lock, like the kind in department stores. But this was the last thing I needed with this nut job running around. I sprinted across the building and took a shortcut through a couple of banquet rooms to make it to the garage. As I was doing so, I saw that crazy guy running up the garage pathway. I slid that door as fast as I could and locked it before he got into the entryway. He then slammed his body into the glass over and over, but the door did not move. I locked the second set of doors just in case he got through the outside ones. He would at least be trapped or slowed down. I reached for my pepper spray, thinking maybe he would just leave, and I yelled, "The cops are here." He started to laugh and howl, and then held the knife up again before running into the darkness of the parking garages. I called the cops on my personal cell phone to let them know that the man has a knife. The dispatcher told me that the cops would be there shortly, and I let her know what happened. I made my way to the front again and locked myself in the security office. At least this place had no windows, and I could watch on camera. I heard another loud thud and realized he was at the front lobby doors trying to get in. I was hoping the cops would roll up at any minute, but they didn't. And while it probably didn't take them long, it felt like forever at this point. The guy was standing at the lobby doors with the knife in hand. He faced the camera, and by this time his hood had fallen back. The top of his head was bald, with wild, long, stringy, crazy hair on the sides of his head. His eyes were huge, and I will never forget that grin on his face as he mouthed to the camera,
"Die. Die."
while making stabbing motions with that knife, blood running across his face from slamming into the glass. He then ran out into the darkness. About 5 minutes later, the cops showed up. They sent one officer. He asked what the guy looked like, and I told him that I have camera footage. He drove through the area first and shined his spotlight. The cop returned to tell me that he couldn't find anyone, and he had driven around the entire block and back area behind the golf course. I showed him the footage and printed out the picture from the camera. The cop said he didn't see any sign of the guy, and that he would patrol the area and call back if he came again. It was now nearly 5 a.m. when the cop left. I waited until about 6 a.m. when it was daylight and people were starting to get out and about, before I walked around and hung up all the phones. This guy literally took all 12 phones off the hook. When my manager came in the morning shift at 8 a.m., I told her what happened, and she said that they would keep an eye out, and they would have a meeting to let everyone who worked here know and to be aware. They had an extra security guard on my shift for 2 weeks, but thankfully the guy never returned.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
When I was 13, I fell in love with a guy who said that he was 17. His family was from Haiti. I was a tomboy back then, so I was just excited to have somebody, anybody, like me. We started a romance. I was with him until about 16. He always snuck me around, and I obviously hid him as well. My mom would kill me if she knew that I had a boyfriend at that age. I would cut school and sneak into his house to, well, you know. His grandma, who he lived with, always creeped me out. She was indigenous and wore long, African-looking dresses and hated me. She saw me a few times and would outwardly show, disgust. I never understood why. Fast forward. I was 16. My boyfriend was acting weird. I got suspicious when I received some prank phone calls. I asked to see his phone logs. Long story short, I called some weird numbers and found out that he was having relations with 12 to 13-year-olds. Still, even though he was with me. I was so angry at this point. He was 20-ish. So I went to the police. I don't know why. I just did. They looked him up and down and told me that he wasn't 20. He was actually 27 and had had former charges for statutory rape. They asked me to tell them where he worked. Turns out he was a pedophile the entire time. No wonder his grandma was disgusted at me. I looked like a child, and she knew his age. He was arrested, and I was asked to testify. This is where the scary stuff happens, by the way, if you've made it this far. 1 week before testifying, I was sleeping in my bed. I had a full-sized bed against the wall. This is important because on the other side of that wall was my mom's room. As a child, I would knock on the wall when I got scared and she would come and rescue me. That night, I was on my back when I woke up with sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I knew because I frantically tried to reach for the wall and couldn't. My limbs felt abnormally heavy and wouldn't budge. I felt serious pressure on my chest, although there was nothing on it. And then I saw it. On my left, standing or kneeling next to me, was what I would call or only describe as a demon. He didn't give me a violent vibe. What was terrifying is it was ominous. Smug even. He looked male, dark skin, almost like a seaweed green. Texture was bumpy, rigid. I just remember extremely sharp features. Pointy nose, pointy head, pointy chin. Very triangular looking. One thing I absolutely cannot forget is the smile. He has an ear-to-ear grin, a confident and perverted smile. I was terrified, unable to scream. And then I felt it. He shoved his disgusting fingers down my throat. This is where it gets almost perverted. It was a vigorous motion. He enjoyed it. It hurt. I closed my eyes and didn't know what else to do but pray. I'm not even religious, and I just prayed and begged for help. I felt the pressure lift off of my body, and my mouth was suddenly clear. I was too scared to move or open my eyes, so I pretended to continue to sleep and ignored the taste of iron in my mouth. I woke up the next morning absolutely mortified. I couldn't speak. My throat felt as if I had swallowed glass. There was blood on my pillow and in my mouth. I ran to my mom. I tried to voice what had happened. She was scared for me, but told me that it was all a dream. I didn't testify. I was scared to speak, and my throat hurt. I was just so stressed with everything, I wanted nothing to do with anybody. He went to jail anyways, because at that point, it was the state against him, not me. Time passed. I grew terrified to sleep alone. I always felt like the demon was in my room. I never saw him again, but I felt his presence everywhere I went. I would sleep facing the door and pray before bed, always. I would hear it in my dreams sometimes telling me, "I'm still here," mocking me as I would run down the stairs in my dream and my legs would grow heavy. I would try to get out of my house, and I had to fight my body to move in my dream. There was even a time when I was at an ex-boyfriend's house years later, and I was brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden out of nowhere felt the hairs on my body rise, and I had this insane panic knowing that the demon was there. He was literally hovering on me. I couldn't see him or smell him or anything, but I felt his presence. I ran to my ex's bed and asked him to sleep on top of me the entire night to protect me. I had never in my life broken down like that. I can't explain it. I just knew that the demon was there trying to break in again. So I was about 22 when I got a phone call from the pedophile ex. He found me and called to check on me. Despite him being sick, he did love me in his own way, I think. I don't know. I don't feel like digging into it. Point is, he found me and called. He thanked me for not testifying. He said it saved him more time in jail. I had to ask. I asked him if he knew anything about demons. I then told him what had happened and asked if he could do anything with it because I remember him telling me things about his grandma doing hoodoo. He was silent. Then he finally told me without many details that he didn't exactly know what his grandmother had done, but all he knew was that a few weeks before the trial, she had come to where he was living with another African-looking guy in very indigenous clothing and asked for a few of my things. He gave them my hairbrush with my hair on it and other trinkets that I had left behind. He told me they took it and left. He doesn't know anything else. I was livid. I never spoke to him again and changed my number. I'm 30 now. I'm still scared to sleep alone. I don't feel the demon anymore, however, but I still have PTSD. I am still scared to have the door closed in my room. I still think about it every night before bed. I pray before bed. Although I never saw him again, I still feel something heavy. Not as bad as that time with my ex years ago in the bathroom, but it's more of a subtle heaviness. 3 years ago at my last apartment, which I believe was haunted, I was always so terrified. I would have scary dreams, the type that happen in your bedroom so you're not really sure if it's a dream or if it's real because everything looks the same. I remember having the urge to run out of my apartment sometimes. Just run. I would be on the couch and I would feel that fight or flight feeling and just jet toward the door and stand in the hallway outside my apartment because I was terrified for no reason. Demons exist. I won't get into other small stories that I have now because they're really not major compared to this one. But I will also say, I think I have experienced angels as well. Small stuff like having lost things appear on my bed when I live alone, or being in a dangerous environment and having a sudden feeling of, I need to stop doing this now, after seeing 2 pillars of parallel fog. If there's anything to feel good about, it's believing at least in the theory of opposites. If there's evil, which we know that there is, then there has to be good as well. This is a 100% true story that happened to me when I was about 12. I lived in a really small town in central Wisconsin with my family. My mom had gotten divorced when I was 8, but it was her and her boyfriend and all my siblings in the house, minus the 3 oldest. I had finally gotten my own room since the 3 oldest moved out, and was so excited, but for the first couple months I didn't sleep in there because I was too scared. So I would sleep with my sister in her room. As we were getting ready to move out of that house, I finally worked up the courage to sleep in my room by myself. My bed was positioned so that when I laid down on my back, I was facing the door. This night in particular, I had kept the bedroom door open because it was a really warm summer night. I remember waking up sometime in the night. I have no idea what time it was, nor do I think I would remember even if I had looked. Anyway, when I woke up, I turned over onto my back and happened to glance outside my door. When I did, I saw this black silhouette of a man who I thought looked just like Abraham Lincoln, tall, thin, with what looked like a top hat and a beard. He was standing right outside my door next to the railing that led to the stairs. I remember staring for a moment, but getting freaked out and covering my head with the blanket and going back to sleep. Fast forward about a year to where we were moved into our new house, a small mobile home in the middle of nowhere, and I had a dream. In the dream, I was back in the old house, my childhood home. I remember all I could think was, I'm home. It felt so calm, so familiar. Everything was exactly how I remembered it, down to my messy room. In my dream, I went exploring through the house, reminiscing. I was so glad to be back, but then I woke up. It was such a nice dream, but I eventually forgot about it. And that was when I had my second dream. It was roughly a month or so later. I was back in my old home, but something was off. As I was walking through, I realized that things were missing. The china cabinet in the dining room was gone, and so was the stereo we had in the living room, and so on. Just little things. It didn't feel as familiar or as happy as the last dream that I had had, but when I woke up yet again, and just like the last time, I eventually forgot about it. Fast forward again to probably 2 or 3 months later, and I had another dream. I was back in my childhood home, surprise, surprise, and again things were missing and the whole energy just felt off. I remember feeling very uneasy and uncomfortable there, but I couldn't leave. And then I saw it again. The Abraham Lincoln-looking shadow that I had seen a year before. He was just wandering the halls upstairs. I got really freaked out and tried to leave, but then I woke up again. And again, I forgot about the dream not too long after. Finally, just a few short months later when I was staying at my grandparents' house, I had what would be the last dream. I was back in my old home again, and this time, everything was gone. The whole house was empty. It probably looked like that because that was how it looked the last time I saw it, right before we officially left. But anyway, I was walking through the house feeling so creeped out, and again like last time, just wanting to leave. It no longer felt like home. Then there was this man or figure. It didn't look like the shadow that I had seen before, but I couldn't make out any features either. He asked me if I was okay, and I said no, and that I wanted to leave. Then he asked, "Would you like to leave with me?" and held out his hand. I got such a bad feeling from him that I said no. He started promising me that if I went with him, that I could go back to my childhood home, back to what was so familiar and happy to me, but I refused, and then I woke up. After that, I told my sister everything. From the shadow man that I saw first, to all the dreams that I had. At first, we thought that maybe I was having some sort of psychic visions, but a few years later, I found out the truth. I found out that the silhouette that I saw was a shadow person after I watched a video by Haley Reese on what they are. Then a couple more years later, after meeting my boyfriend, whose whole family is very into the supernatural, I found out what the whole thing actually meant. He explained to me that demons often come to you in dreams to attempt to possess you. They'll start by creating a situation that's familiar and comforting. But after a dream or two, they start adding or taking things away, slowly, so as not to make it obvious. You start to become uncomfortable and threatened and scared, until one time they're the only thing that makes you feel safe. And that's when they have you. They'll promise you everything good you could ever want, and as soon as you say yes, you're saying yes to them taking over your body. My boyfriend explained that I was very smart for saying no, and for telling my sister. Because by telling my sister, I basically broke the demon's hold. That's apparently why back in the old days, people would tell their dreams to someone. because it basically breaks the hold of whatever demon or spirit may be trying to possess you. This paranormal encounter took place at the hotel I worked at last year. I was 20 years old, working at a small mom-and-pop hotel in Ontario, California. I had worked there for some time before I started to stay there for a few months. The owner taught me everything that I needed to know so that I can run his business while he went on a business trip to Africa. Mind you, I didn't have a car, so my only option was to stay there and work around the clock if need be. I didn't have to pay for the room, and I got to wash my clothes in the laundry room. There was a grocery store in walking distance, and restaurants all around me where I could get food at a discounted price since I worked at the hotel. I thought this was a sweet deal. One night, my boyfriend came down to visit, and while he was in the bathroom, I heard banging coming from the room next to ours. Then, I heard scratching on my walls. I told him to stop playing, and he didn't even know what I was talking about. The banging continued all night, so I called the front desk and told them that the people next to me were loud and that I had to be up at 6 to go down there to work. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that she hadn't rented out the room next to mine. Mind you, I had an end room. I quickly ran outside to see if the curtains were open or closed, and they were open. I could see right into that room, and no one was there. I had never been so creeped out in all my life. I decided to sage the room to get rid of any bad spirits or energy, and that worked for a while, until it didn't. The next time, something demonic happened. I was asleep and kept hearing whispers in my sleep. I hate whispers with a passion, and they creep me out to the fullest. So I sat up in bed and I was looking around the dark room, and in the corner of the room, I saw white, glowing eyes staring at me. I felt frozen by its glare. I could see its body and saw that it was crouched down, holding its knees. Then I saw more shadows appearing closer and closer. I went to turn on the lamp next to the bed, and it didn't cut on. So my next thought was that I needed to run outside and get to safety. It took all the balls in the world for me to get up and do that. I was so scared that I couldn't even feel my legs. All I could feel was the cold wooden floor beneath me. I got to the door and flung it open, only to see that the bedroom curtains were on the outside of my room's window. The sky was black, and the clouds were a dark green with gray tint. I was mortified to realize that I was still asleep, and that I hadn't actually woken up. I looked back inside the hotel room and saw myself asleep in the bed. I screamed bloody murder, and that's when I jolted awake for real. I said a prayer and went back to sleep. The encounter that followed was even worse. Yet again, I could hear things in my sleep. I was terrified and couldn't move any part of my body. I began to pray in my head as loud as I could, only to wake and feel my body slam on the bed as if I had been levitating. I called my grandma the next day, and she said that it was a demonic attack. I got my car shortly after a few days later, and never stayed in that hotel again. When I was approximately 15 years old, circa 1988-89, myself and my family had 2 summer holidays in Portugal, one following on from the previous year. The first holiday included myself, my older sister, mom and dad, and an uncle and aunt. The second holiday the following summer was the same people, except my sister, who stayed at home. Both holidays were in the same location, and both times we stayed in the same villa, which was owned by a business associate of my uncle. As such, I believe the accommodation was free, and that's why it was such a great holiday option for us all. The villa was situated about a 15 minutes walk outside of a well-known town. The first holiday where my sister was also present was event-free, and nothing unexplained happened at all. The second holiday was where I alone experienced an absolutely terrifying paranormal event, which has stayed with me to this day. The villa we stayed in was on one level, as most villas are, and had a pretty standard layout. The main door at the front led straight into a kitchen, and that led into the main lounge area. Off to the left and the right of the main lounge were two ensuite bathrooms where my parents and uncle and aunt slept. I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge area, and out to the back of the property was a small swimming pool. From memory, it was a very nice, spacious villa, and probably worth quite a bit of money. Nothing happened for the entire 2-week period that we were there, except for the final night of the holiday. I often say thank God that we flew home the next morning, because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. On this final evening, everyone had just gone to bed and closed their doors, and I had just finished setting up my bed and finally turned out the lights and got under the covers. No longer than 30 seconds after getting into bed, I began to hear tapping on one of the walls. I laid there trying to guess what it might be, and just figured that it was probably one of my parents or uncle or aunt doing something in their rooms, so I ignored it. I then heard the same tapping again, but louder. I sat up in bed and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. This is how I know that it wasn't sleep paralysis, as some people have often suggested to me, because I was peering across the dimly lit lounge room. It was then that the tapping started to spin around the room, as if the knocking was circling me as I sat there. This was naturally pretty unnerving, and I struggled to rationalize what was taking place. It was at that point that the tapping stopped, and immediately a wooden chair from the lounge room dining table made a scraping sound against the wood parquet floor that it was resting on. The sort of scraping noise a chair would make if you pulled it out from under the table to sit on it. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and being as young as I was, I think fear got the better of me, and I shot down into the bed, turned around, and pulled the sheets up under my chin and closed my eyes. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Next, I heard more scraping as dining chairs were being moved, followed by a very quiet, but very distinct, shuffling noise, which sounded like shuffling footsteps. These footsteps got louder as whatever it was began to approach me in the room. As it approached, I then heard this mumbling in what sounded like guttural, low-key talking, but in a language that I didn't understand or recognize. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. On top of this mumbling, I suddenly began to hear this terrifying, rasping breathing in and out in a very rhythmic fashion, the sort of rasping that someone with severe breathing difficulty would make. This breathing got louder and louder until it was right behind me, right next to my head, on the pillow, rasping loudly into my right ear. Petrified doesn't even cut it. I was simply frozen with fear. I don't think I could have turned around, even if I had wanted to. This loud, heavy breathing continued for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably about 30 or 40 seconds, and then it slowly faded away, and the room was left in silence. I laid in the bed for about another hour, unable to sleep, and listening intently for anything else, but there was nothing. Eventually I fell asleep, probably through nervous exhaustion, and when I next woke up it was 6 a.m., and daylight filled the room, and I recall the sheer feeling of relief. The first thing I did was get up and looked at the dining table area, and sure enough, 2 chairs had been moved away from their normal resting positions. And not just by a small amount, but significantly so. I also checked the rest of the communal areas in the villa to see if any doors or windows had been left open, but there was nothing. When my family got up, I told them all about what had happened, and unfortunately I was met with mainly skepticism, which I found a little upsetting at the time. To be honest, I think the experience affected me to the degree where I probably needed to go get counseling to really process it and to help get over it. But of course nothing like that was available at the time. In 2017, my girlfriend and I moved into a tiny, kinda crappy house in our college town. The house was made by a couple of students a few years prior, so the architecture was a bit sloppy. For example, the roof was flat. Take note of this because it'll be important later. However, the house was really cheap and close to campus, so it seemed like a total steal. The first couple months living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but it wasn't too long before we began experiencing strange paranormal activities. The first odd occurrence was with our smoke detectors. Our smoke detectors would go off constantly. It was strange because they would go off even if there wasn't smoke in the house, from our bad cooking, for example. We thought that maybe it was because of old batteries, but no matter how many times we changed them, it never made a difference. It got to the point where they were going off 3 to 5 times a day, and at that, we just broke down and took the batteries out of them altogether. Note, there were 6 detectors in total. However, even without the batteries, the detectors were still going off. So out of desperation, we turned off the entire smoke detector circuit to the house. It was at this point when things started getting really out of control. The back room/storage room in the house always had a really eerie feeling, like someone was watching you or standing just behind you staring down at you. Thankfully, me and my girlfriend's bedroom was the furthest room in the house away from the storage area, so I avoided it like the plague. Anyways, one night around 3 a.m., the smoke detector in our bedroom goes off. However, it's not the usual repetitive beeping, it's a single, long beep. It sounded like when someone holds the test button on a detector. Frustrated, my girlfriend grabs a chair from the dining room and stands on it to reach the detector, but moments before she touches it, the beeping stops. We both groan in irritation as she goes to put the chair back, but before she makes it to the dining room, the detector down the hallway from our room makes the same continuous beep. Just like before, she stands on the chair to reach the detector, but right before grabbing it, it stops. Our smoke detectors continued this pattern all the way back to the creepy storage room. This happened 2 more times that night. It was as if whatever was messing with us was trying to lead us to its space. This would happen to us at least once or twice a week for the next 1.5 years that we lived there. Shortly after the encounters with the smoke detectors, the house became absolutely infested with bugs. There was no history of bug issues when we bought the home, and it started almost immediately after our first experience with the detectors. Bugs would pour out of light fixtures, small cracks in the walls, counters, and of course, the smoke detectors. Literally, 1 minute everything would be fine, and then the next, winged insects or ants would pour out of the walls. We had multiple exterminators come, but less than a week after treating the house, the bugs would be back, just as bad as before. It made us miserable, and I've never seen an infestation to that extreme. It was absolutely unnatural. After these events, we began feeling really terrified and depressed. We both hated being home, but there was no other place for us to go. This was when the footsteps started. Remember how I said our roof was flat? At least a few times a week we would hear large, heavy, possibly hoof-like footsteps on the roof. We tried writing it off as being animals, so whenever we heard the steps we would run outside to see if we could spot whatever the animal was. But there was never anything there. The steps were very far apart from one another. Whatever was walking on our roof would start from the creepy storage room and in maybe 3 or 4 steps walk to our bedroom. The steps were so loud that it sounded like whatever was haunting us was either very big or stomping to get our attention. Now began the phantom sounds. We had large metal bowls that we used for daily cooking, so when we were done we would wash them and set them on the counter to dry. The first time it happened, me and my girlfriend were sitting on the couch in the living room. The kitchen was right next to the living room, but there was an island that blocked our view to the sink area. Anyways, on this night we were startled by the sound of our multiple, metal bowls being thrown off of the counter. At this time, we didn't have pets, so we assumed the worst and thought that someone might be breaking into the house. We both shot up and ran over to face our worst fear, but not only was no one in the house, nothing in the kitchen had been moved. The bowls were still on the counter, just where we left them. This was the most common paranormal occurrence in the house, and it happened at least 5 to 10 times a day at all hours. After a while, we were so sick and tired of these disturbances that we stopped using our metal bowls, or if we did use them, we would hand dry them and put them away right after use. This didn't make the spirit very happy, so next, we started hearing what sounded like our ceramic plates being thrown to the ground, and our kitchen cabinets slamming over and over again. Do you know those types of cabinet hinges that close slowly? Yeah, that's what we had. So, to slam the cabinets like that, they would have had to have been closed with excessive force. The next phase in our haunting was sightings and photographs. The phone I had at the time had one of those automatic face tracking features, meaning that when you would take pics on my phone, the yellow boxes would appear around the person's face to focus on them. One night I was taking a picture in me and my girlfriend's bedroom when a yellow face tracker square appeared at the foot of our bed, way above our bed. If that was a person, they would have had to have been at least 7 feet tall. At the time, we did have posters on our bedroom walls, so while focusing on the face tracker square, I circled the room to confirm that the tracker wasn't just focusing on one of them by accident. To my dismay, no matter where I was in the room, or from what angle, the square stayed in the exact same place. Oh yeah, even better, I was home alone for a few nights. I don't think I've ever experienced such sheer terror as I did when I went to sleep that night. After this first encounter, having cameras track faces in our pictures became a constant occurrence all throughout the house. The final phase of our haunting before getting the heck out of there was physical encounters. This happened more often to my girlfriend than me, but something would occasionally grab and pull our hair, especially when we were walking through the living room. But the most terrifying experience goes to our friend Jamie. She came to visit us for a few nights, and while she was there, she would sleep on our couch. She was aware of all the paranormal encounters in the house, and she had seen most of them firsthand, but nothing compared to what was about to happen. It was around 3 a.m. when she woke up with an eerie, uncomfortable feeling. All of a sudden, she experienced what felt like someone or something stepping up onto the couch. It stepped both of its feet up, one on either side of her body. Starting from her feet, it slowly walked up the length of her body until it felt like 2 feet were on either side of her head. She said she felt an intense, malevolent energy staring down at her, but she was too terrified to open her eyes. Meanwhile, the cabinets in the kitchen began to slam over and over. For the next few hours, she pretended to be asleep all the while this presence was standing over her. She told me she's not exactly sure when it went away, because she eventually became so exhausted that she did fall back asleep. Not too long after this experience, we were finally able to sell the house and get the heck out. We lost tons of money because we sold it for way less than we had originally paid. I can't help but feel bad for the person who bought the home, but it's been almost 3 years and she's still living there. I think the takeaway from this story is if a house is priced too good to be true, then it is. When I was younger, my parents had gotten divorced. My dad was an abusive alcoholic who drained my mom out of a lot of money, so my mom and I left at the time. My aunt offered to let us stay at her house until we got back on our feet. Now, my aunt lives in the countryside. It's miles of farmland and a few houses every now and then. Her neighborhood is small, but everyone keeps to themselves. The area my aunt lives in is called the Base. Apparently soldiers were housed there, and eventually died and were buried on that land. Don't know the exact history, though. Driving to her place at night is super creepy and confusing. You can easily get lost, so everyone aims to reach home before the sun sets. Now back to my story. My aunt had a second house, not too far away, where her family would go to do gardening and just chill out sometimes. My cousins and my aunt thought it would be a great idea to spend a night there. The house was an old, abandoned Baptist church converted to a house that my aunt had inherited. The previous owner was a seer woman and would do readings and even give exorcisms for people. My aunt took care of her when she was ill, therefore she gave the house to my aunt. The inside was run down, one couch for about 10 of us, yeah, it was a big family, and a dirty bathroom with an annoying leaky pipe. Light barely entered the house during the day. It also gave an eerie vibe to it, because being in that house or on the land, it was always dead silent despite being surrounded by nature. That night, we all had these little rooms to sleep in, with there being so many of us that we had to share. My mom and I were in one room when I woke up to the sound of the wooden door being creaked open. I turned to see my mother upright, shaking and obviously full of fear. No one came through the door, but you could hear these loud, heavy footsteps around and inside the house. It woke everyone up, so we all huddled in the living room. All of a sudden, the lights cut off. We lit some lamps, and my uncle was getting ready to check on the noise outside when a loud banging came at the front door. It was around 1 a.m., and this place was completely deserted. We all stood still and quiet, and then the banging grew even more violent. The door began to shake, and a guttural, demonic voice was asking to be let in. Panic and terror struck all of us. My younger cousins began to scream and cry because the voice was unnatural, pure evil. The adults sent us into one room and they formed a prayer circle in the middle of the living room. Everyone's backs were turned to the window, but I was the only one facing it, and I remember very clearly seeing a tall man with horns and a red aura looking back at me from outside. He was smiling at me, motioning me to come toward him. He had these long, black fingernails that he began to scrape the window with. At this point, everyone could hear it, but by the time they turned to the window, he had vanished. However, all the doors started banging and the windows were rattling. We kids all ran out to the living room and joined the prayer circle, reciting the mantras from my religion, and then suddenly it stopped. The sun was now peeking in. It was 6 a.m. Everything felt like an hour, but we couldn't account for the rest of the time that had passed. We stayed for a few months in my aunt's original house, without ever visiting that second house. My mom eventually got remarried, so we moved. It's been about 17 years or so since that incident, and we rarely visit my aunt, like maybe once or twice a year. Since then, however, the house has been demolished. My aunt has said that strange things occurred whenever she was on that land after that incident, and she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't handle it, and they eventually sold the land, too. I would like to preface by saying that I am a Roman Catholic who has experienced paranormal phenomena since I was 5. My late grandmother had experienced similar phenomena, and my mother and sisters also, but to a much lesser degree. As I get older, I notice the experiences are slightly more darker in nature. I know very little of demonology, other than what has been referenced in the Bible. I try to stay away from anything referencing demons, the devil, etc., which is why this experience was so difficult and I was not prepared. In October of 2018, I was admitted to the hospital due to an electrolyte imbalance. I was in a room with 3 other female patients. On my second night, my arms were finally free of the IV, so I was able to move around and assist the other women, who weren't as mobile, in getting ready for bed. One of the women was much older and cranky. She seemed to take an instant dislike to me when I first moved into the room, but warmed up to me after I helped her. When the lights went out, I decided to lay on my stomach and say my silent prayers. To the casual observer, it would have looked as if I was asleep. During this time, I could hear the woman that I helped argue with herself about me. She stated that I was nice, and then she replied to herself stating that I am not what I seem or something to that effect, and it went back and forth like that during my prayers. Shortly after, the room started getting really cold, really fast. I silently prayed to God to watch over her and free her from any negative influences. It was then that I heard her say these words very loudly. I don't know the Lord's Prayer, and my name. I freaked out, quickly processing what had just happened. The woman knew that I was praying over her, and there was no way that she could have known that. In my mind, I instinctively knew that I was not up for the confrontation. I was weak, and still recovering. I got up from my bed, and with my back to her, I said something like, "There's no way I can stay here now." To which she answered, "Yes, go. I won," and laughed really hard. I was amazed that the other two women had slept through it. It was around 10 p.m. when this occurred. The room was stiflingly cold at this point, and I ran to reception and asked to be discharged, but the charge nurse said that I couldn't leave without my doctor discharging me. I begged again to be discharged, but was denied, and the nurses tried to call me as they got a hold of my doctor, who said that he would be in at 7 a.m. and that I needed to stay put. I asked to be relocated to another room in the interim, but the only available room was directly next door, and that was way too close for my liking, so they put me in the day room with a blanket and pillow. I used my phone to call my sister to get me out of the hospital. She works at another hospital, and told me the car wasn't home and to catch an Uber to her place. The ward was locked down for the evening though, so I couldn't leave anyway, and chose to just stay in the day room. The TV was on standby, but I could hear voices coming from it, even though the screen was blank. The voices talked about a shooting at the hospital I was in, with thousands of fatalities. It then talked about my baby nephew being in a plane that was shot down. By then, I was truly hysterical, as fear for my family took root and everything I learned went out the window. Throughout this time, the voices from the TV continued calling me names, etc. I couldn't stay any longer in the day room, and the nurses had me on a stretcher right in front of the main desk, where the charge nurse could see me. It felt like a really bad dream, and I was hysterical and paranoid. I laid down on the stretcher, and that's when I noticed hanging overhead the ward number 66. I was also on the 6th floor of the hospital. I wondered if that was why there was so much activity there. Not long after, I started hearing other voices coming from different rooms of the ward asking about me. They seemed to be communicating to each other and laughing. I started silently praying again with more conviction. A male patient in the ward nearest my stretcher started crying out for help, claiming that I was hurting him. I prayed even harder, citing the Lord's Prayer. He asked the nurse for the name of the lady outside hurting him, and she gave him my first name. He started crying again, joined by another voice 2 doors down. I prayed to know who they were in Jesus' name, and all these voices talked at once, but the one name that I could clearly make out was Beelzebub. I continued to pray throughout the first night as they taunted, laughed, cackled, and cried. At this point, the light in the man's hospital room was turned on as a nurse was with him trying to calm him down. I had been sitting up on my stretcher bed whilst praying, and watched his silhouette as he tried to inch his way to the open doorway. It was then that I noticed the odd shadow that he cast. It was so strange. It looked like a spiky-headed being with a dog. Spiky-headed in an almost cartoonish way like Bart Simpson. It continued until morning, and I was moved to a small private room awaiting the doctor. The voices were still verbally attacking and threatening me, but my hysteria was long gone by that point, and I was just determined to leave. I ended up discharging myself before the doctor arrived, but had to return as I still had the IV catheter in my arm. On my return, they placed me in another ward. I refused to go back to Ward 66, and I was allowed to recover in peace. And eventually, the demonic taunting stopped. I had a course of bad luck following that event. Basically, all of 2019 was a series of misfortunes and bad luck that still hasn't come right. I don't know what to do other than just keep moving on. I went to a psychiatrist last December who said that other than the trauma I would need their help with, I was in good mental health. When I was in middle school, my mother and father did not live together. Eventually, we all moved into this apartment together in the local town. The local town is peaceful, calm, and barely any crime happens here. Obviously, when you're a kid, you can get scared of the dark and stuff like that. However, this wasn't just being afraid of what lurks in the darkness, because there was actually something watching me as I fell asleep. The first night I slept there, I just kept getting the feeling as if something was staring at me from the hallway. My bed was almost completely centered to where the door was, and my door was always open, so I would always be able to see what was outside. And I would just stare, always, down the hallway, thinking that something was looking back at me. It wasn't long after that before I started actually having paranormal encounters. The first paranormal encounter I ever had, one night I was sleeping in my bed. I remember feeling like something was watching me again, except this time, I rolled over to see a large, black, shadowy man standing in my doorway. My eyes began to tear up, and I hid under my sheets, but this strange pressure came over my body. It was almost as if I couldn't breathe or talk, and then my ears would start ringing, and I would fall asleep with a snap of a finger. Then I would have this nightmare of my parents coming into my room slowly, coming over to my bedside table, and screaming at me. Their faces would just rot away into this deep, black shadow face, which I named Black Eyes. I would then wake up, usually in a completely different room, not knowing what I was doing. Sometimes I would be standing in the bathroom, or laying on the couch in the living room. A few times I would be standing over my parents' bed, just looking at them. This event reoccurred more times than I can even count. Then, finally, my family began to notice the figure as well. My mother at the time would have friends over and they would say something like, "Did you just see that man walk down your hallway?" She would see it too. The same thing that I saw that would stare at me and put me to sleep at night. There would be strange events around the apartment, such as the TV changing channels, random phone calls from unknown numbers in the middle of the night. One of the most random occurrences in the house would be the random, horrible smell of death coming from the bathroom. This happened about once a week at a random hour. Nobody could figure out why the bathroom would smell like rotting death, and no matter how hard my mother attempted to clean the bathroom, the smell would not go away until about 2 hours later. It would just randomly disappear, with no explanation as to what it could have been. Many people who came over would see this shadow figure. My father didn't want to believe it, as he didn't believe in ghosts, but my mother was fully prepared. She had lived in a haunted house before and wasn't surprised by what was happening. Nobody would act like they believed me when I tried to tell them what I was seeing and why I was sleepwalking at night, but in reality, I think my mother was scared. She didn't want to tell me, with me being a kid and all, that I was possibly being possessed by this shadow man and being forced to walk around the house at night. Then came one night when we had to call the police. There was music coming from downstairs around 1 to 2 a.m. We knew that the downstairs neighbors had just moved out of the apartment, but we were awoken by this church-type music. We informed the police, and they came down to the apartment only to find a locked door. They busted it down to find absolutely nothing but music on a track playing by itself in the middle of the room. We were informed of this, and that only created more of a mystery. It was evident by that point that there was something in that apartment. Something dark. Something that didn't have good intentions. Eventually, after a few years, we decided it was time to move out. We had gotten a puppy, and she was barking down the hallway at nothing, and one night a plate fell onto the ground from the cabinet. It was time to go. The final night in the apartment, my mother and I both awakened to a horrible noise of what sounded like a chainsaw destroying the kitchen cabinets. We both ran out to turn on the lights and find absolutely nothing. We both looked at each other like, "Did you hear that?" But couldn't say anything, and went back to bed. It was completely terrifying. I'm not sure what we were dealing with at this apartment. I'd like to say that it was just a ghost, but it seemed powerful. I believe in the paranormal, but am skeptical about most of the stories that people tell. It's extremely hard to distinguish between a fabricated story and a true story when you can't see facial expressions or hear changes in a person's voice. About a week ago, I was sitting in my kitchen browsing the web, probably Reddit, on my phone. My kids had been asleep for about an hour, and my wife was in our room finishing up a paper for work. There wasn't a radio or television on. While browsing in complete silence, I heard my wife cough several times. The cough sounded as if she had breathed in some water and was trying to get it out of her lungs. Jokingly, I jumped out of my chair and ran over to the room where she was sitting. I started patting her back and pulling her earlobes down, again in a joking manner. She looked at me like, "What the hell?" So I told her I was trying to help since she had coughed so hard. She, still with the what the hell face, looked at me and said that she hadn't coughed. I stood there and evaluated what I may have heard. I thought it might have been one of my kids, but the cough was from a woman. It wasn't a 4-year-old or 1-year-old girl's cough. Other things about this cough is that it came from inside the house. It was the type of hack like after water goes down the wrong pipe. It was one succession of coughs, about 4 of them together. How did the coughing not continue if the coughs were heard that hard at the beginning? It didn't and still does not make sense. But that's not the only thing that happened. Fast forward to the next morning. My kids are awake and eating in the kitchen. I'm in the living room watching TV, still waking and drinking coffee, and my wife is in our room getting ready for the day. All electronics are off except the TV and our phones. My wife's phone rings from what sounds like the kitchen area. She runs to the kitchen to answer it because she was expecting an important phone call from work. She searches for her phone in the kitchen, but does not find it. She asks if it was my phone that rang, but I told her no. My phone was in my pocket. Turns out, both my wife's work phone and personal phone are in our room on the other side of the house. We checked the kitchen and surrounding rooms for anything that could have made the ring, but we found nothing. I don't know the name of the ringtone, but it's a very common ringtone for iPhones. My wife and I searched for the reasoning of why we clearly heard a phone ring in the kitchen, but no matter how hard we tried, we were unable to find a logical explanation. I was going to write it off as just another weird coincidence, but I kept thinking of how clear the phone ringing was, and how my wife had heard it too. Add this one to the cough that I heard the night before, and I start to worry that there may be an intruder in my attic. I think, nah, not possible. But I have 2 little girls and a little boy too. It's a slim chance, but I'd feel better if I just went up there and checked. I texted my wife to watch the kids because I was worried that there might be an intruder. I didn't want to verbalize it because if they were up there, then they would hear me. I check outside and around the house first for any signs of a person being on the roof, or anything like that. I look for cuts in the wall, and see no signs of intrusion whatsoever. I then grab the ladder to get inside the attic. The only way into this attic is through a small 2x4-foot opening at the top of the interior of a closet in one of the rooms. I grab my flashlight and my gun, set the ladder up, and plan on entering the attic as quickly and tactfully as possible. I don't want the intruder to be lying in wait. I push the drywall that blocks the opening and can hear a door swing and shut. I say swing because it sounded like a door that was on a hinge or hinges. I can't get the drywall off, and the element of surprise is now gone. I push through anyway and inspect the attic. The attic has no floorboards. You have to navigate through it by standing on the supporting beams. It's extremely annoying to have to go up there to do housework. I find no signs of anyone being up there, no entry points, and again, no cuts in any of the walls. I come down and double check that my wife and kids had stayed in the living room like I had asked in case there was an intruder. She confirms that they were, and that no door had been shut. I pretty much already knew that the door shutting wasn't them because the sound came from the attic, but there's no door in the attic. I went through a checklist of explanations to the cough, the phone ring, and the door shutting, and again, have yet to encounter a single one that makes sense. I know it sounds weird, but a freaking portal is what I'm coming up with. I lived in this house for years, and have always heard weird noises, but never something like this. Most portal stories I've heard sound totally far-fetched. Usually a portal story includes a demon, or something spiritual, but this was just totally random. People crossing dimensions to hang out in my attic? There's no malice, no sightings, no physical evidence, but the sounds were definitely heard and are inexplicable. Something else happened a few nights ago. It was around 11 p.m. I'm asleep in bed and am woken up to my wife shaking me. She tells me that she heard a door close. I say to her that it may be our 4-year-old, but she says she was watching the monitor and the cameras were on the kids. She said that she had been watching the monitor because she had been hearing weird noises. I say maybe it's just the house creaking. She claims that she heard the windows shake. Now this is significant to me because we do have some old windows. The difference between the old and new windows is that the old windows will rattle when a door is shut due to air pressure or when the house is shaking, earthquakes, and the new windows won't. So she heard a door close and the windows shake. That's enough for me to grab my gun and check for an intruder yet again. I do an interior and exterior check, and of course, find nothing. I go back to bed, and once again conclude that there is a portal in my house. I believe in the paranormal, but I will go out of my way to weigh out every logical explanation that I can possibly think of before assuming that something is paranormal. I've told myself that this is sleep paralysis to make myself feel better, but it was such an odd encounter. I was 14 at the time that this occurred. I'm now in my late 20s. And I was really into gothic stuff, witchcraft, spooky shit, etc. I had a friend who had a Ouija board and wanted to come spend the night and play with it. Of course, I jumped on the idea, so she came right over. As I predicted, absolutely nothing happened. Though at one point the piece did slide off of the board, but we ended up blaming each other. I'm still pretty sure it was her. After a while, as I said, we got bored, and we gave up and went to sleep. About a week later, I came home from school and felt tired, which was abnormal for me because I'd normally throw my backpack down and immediately go outside, but I decided that I would take a nap. No one was home except me. I went to bed and passed out immediately. I woke up and couldn't move, and panicked. I've never had sleep paralysis before, nor had I even heard of it. So needless to say, this was horrifying. I then levitated off of my bed and toward the middle of my room, where I began to rotate in a slow circle. I felt like I was screaming internally, yet no sound was coming out of me, and then I finally woke up. I bolted out of my room and stayed up for the rest of that day. My mom insisted that it was sleep paralysis, and reassured me that it happens to people sometimes, so I thought nothing of it, and moved on. About a month later, it happens again, at night this time. I floated toward the center of the room like before, and promptly from there was slammed against my upper walls and ceiling by some sort of force that I couldn't see. I could feel its hands on me though, and I could physically feel myself hitting the wall. I felt tingly as well, as if my soul might fly out of me. I don't know exactly how to describe this feeling. It was almost like I was vibrating, like when your foot falls asleep, but the needle jab numbness feeling doesn't feel quite painful. It was strange. I thought it was just sleep paralysis and reminded myself that I was dreaming to try and calm down, and started sort of willing myself to wake up, if that makes sense. I woke up, put on some music, and went back to sleep, and slept fine. The next morning I got up for school and was absolutely covered in bruises. It literally looked as though someone had beaten me with a baseball bat. So I told my mom, who said that I had probably just thrashed around in my sleep. This wouldn't be possible though, because I slept on a very soft, queen-size mattress and I'm a small person. I even went around my bed to see if there's anything that I could have bumped into. There was nothing. She said maybe I had hit myself in my sleep. But there were bruises on my back and shoulders too, so it just didn't make sense. I tried to just brush it off, but by this point I was getting really paranoid. For the next few weeks I would have instances where I would start to fall asleep. My body would tingle like it did in the last experience, and I knew that if I let myself fall asleep that I would have the weird sleep paralysis again. So I would force myself awake and adjust my sleeping position and then try to fall asleep once more. I would do this repeatedly until I could finally drift off without this tingly sensation. This became a daily thing, but I was okay with that because I figured out how to basically avoid sleep paralysis and thought that the creepy dreams were over with. A couple of months go by with no incidents, and I had pretty much forgotten about it. By this point it never really crossed my mind anymore, but I would still have the tingly feeling from time to time. It was Saturday. My mom was out with friends, my siblings were visiting family, and I was home alone. I kept feeling very strongly like I was being watched, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid, and that it was nothing. This is where it gets weird. I'm sitting on my bed, wide awake, writing in my journal. It's about 9 p.m. or so. The radio is on full blast, and all of a sudden I'm snatched off of my bed while wide awake by this invisible thing. I start screaming, and it starts slamming me into walls again. Finally, after a few minutes, it stops, and I float back to the center of the room, where I slowly start spinning in circles mid-air, much like the first experience. Only this time I can see myself lying on my bed on my back, with my legs crossed as they were when I was sitting there, hyperventilating with my eyes open while some sort of figure sits next to me. It looked like it would be extremely tall if it stood up. It was skinny with a masculine-looking build. Think tall and very skinny but muscular man. It had shoulder-length wavy hair, though it was really more of just like a shadowy outline of hair. Its body was made up of swirling black smoke only, and I don't know how to explain this any better. This smoke was darker than just being black. Like, imagine if the color black could be darker than it already is. That's what that color was. I have literally never seen a color this dark anywhere else. It was like seeing a color that no one has ever seen. The thing had big yellow almond-shaped eyes and a tiny black pupil in the middle of each one, but I couldn't discern any facial features. It didn't move. It just sat there staring at me for what felt like hours. Finally, I jump awake, and I'm laying in a pool of sweat. I immediately start crying and flipping out because, like I said before, I did not fall asleep. I was wide awake and sitting up when this happened. I wasn't even thinking about sleep. I wasn't even tired. My pen was still in my hand, my radio was still up loud, and my legs were still crossed. Maybe I fainted, but that's never happened to me before. Thankfully, we moved shortly after that, and it never happened again. But to this day, the hair on my arms stands up when I remember this thing. I've read a lot about sleep paralysis demons and experiences, and nothing seems to quite match what happened to me. This happened around the end of November of last year, while I was at a late-night party at a mutual friend's house. The night started off fine, with us having a few drinks and talking about the classes that we would be taking next semester. This pretty much went on till around 2 a.m., and by this time I wanted to go home since the party was already dying down and most of my friends had already left and I was practically there alone. Instead of wasting money on an Uber, I decided to walk home since my neighborhood was only a few blocks away, but it was still a decent walk. However, there was a shortcut. There was a secluded dirt road in the neighborhood which led to a stretch of walkway with an irrigation canal for crops, and it happened to lead straight to the backyard of my house. I began making my way to the lonely dirt road, and I started to second-guess my decisions since that stretch of walkway can be pretty shady, especially at night since a few drug dealers and junkies like to hang out there. I mustered up the little courage I had, feeling confident that I'd be able to handle myself if anything ever hit the fan, so I proceeded to walk on the desolate road. The night sky was well lit. The moon illuminated my surroundings enough for me to see my environment pretty clearly. The walk was actually pleasant. The only thing that made it tough to navigate was the overgrown, thorny weeds and mesquite branches that kept scraping against the exposed parts of my skin. As I continued to walk through the brush, I finally got to the clearing that led to the bridge, and to my relief, there didn't seem to be anyone in sight. As I began to cross the bridge, I then picked up a faint scent of lavender mixed with something rancid, like the smell of a good cheese or days-old roadkill. I couldn't even tell where it was coming from, but as soon as I made it to the other side of the bridge, the environment seemed to suddenly shift. It's hard to describe, but there was this heavy pressure that washed over me, like being submerged underwater, coupled with this gut feeling telling me that something about the environment was just off. I pushed the feeling off as a random anxiety attack, since I do get them sometimes, but deep down I knew this was different. To calm my nerves, I stopped walking and did slow breathing and began to count to 10 while clenching and releasing my fist to try and shake off this bad vibe or whatever it was. When I finished my little ritual, I felt a little better and more at ease. I started to walk in the direction of my house until I heard this odd grunting sound come from behind me. I turned around, and I saw a woman with short black hair and a silky white gown crouched down with her back turned away from me. She was just a few feet away, and it was strange because when I crossed the bridge, I didn't see anyone around the area. Did I pass by her without even realizing it? I thought to myself. She was hunched over, after all, and I do tend to get caught up in my own little world. At this point, the faint smell from earlier was just overbearing, so much so that it started seeping into my sense of taste. I covered my mouth with the bottom of my t-shirt, trying to shield myself from it, while I yelled out the muffled words, "Hello, ma'am? Do you need any help?" She paid no mind to me as she continued to make that weird grunting sound, and I was creeped out at this point, so I walked away a couple steps and turned to get a better look at her. She then decided to stand up, still with her back turned to me, and muttered the word muerte, which means death in Spanish. Confused, trying to understand what the strange woman had said to me, she then slowly turned to meet my gaze, and all the blood in my body pooled in my gut when I saw her face. It was extremely long, too long for a normal human body to be supporting it. The head of this thing almost resembled that of a horse or a donkey's head, and the eyes. I'll never forget the eyes, as much as I've tried to. They were gaping pits of blackness surrounded by a sea of red. Complete silence fell over the area as I was petrified by what I was witnessing. My brain, a scrambling mess, was trying to make sense of the unnatural abomination that was before me. The creature then decided to let out what I can only describe as a high-pitched scream, like a cross between a pig squealing and a woman's wailing. My fight-or-flight reflex then kicked in, and I started sprinting to my house. I didn't even bother trying to unlock the gate to my fence. I jumped over it with ease. My grandmother saw when I came barging into the house. The words wouldn't even leave my mouth to tell her what I had seen, as the fatigue quickly kicked in after the adrenaline wore off. But afterwards, I described everything to her. With a look of urgency, she then decided to perform a cleansing ritual. The ritual involved rubbing an egg all across my body in 3 circular motions while chanting a special prayer. She then cracked the egg that she was using into a clear glass cup that was half filled with water, and when she did, the egg came out with streams of blood, and the yolk that came out of the egg looked similar to a human pupil, which is a very bad omen for the person who is being cleansed. After seeing this, she laid her hands on my forehead and chanted another prayer for about a minute, and threw the raw yolk out of our house and into the driveway. She didn't bother to say anything to me until the following morning, when she reluctantly told me that what I encountered was an entity that specifically preys on men, kind of like a succubus, and told me that this thing had a very dark and malicious intent, and that I was lucky to have gotten away from it. To this day, I haven't set foot on that stretch of road again. I'm a sheriff's deputy in a fairly busy county. Along with this job comes the unfortunate familiarity with what a decomposing human body smells like. To me, it's very similar to an animal carcass, but with a much sweeter odor. Not sweet in the sense that I enjoy it. Hell no. That smell normally means a bad night for me and another gruesome memory to add to my catalog of things that I would rather forget. With that out of the way, I'll get to what happened. Last night I was patrolling a geographically isolated area of the county which is very large and sparsely populated. Having completed the hour-long trek to the northwestern county line, I began driving through the mountains back toward civilization. About 25 miles from town, or the closest semblance thereof, I hit a straight stretch of highway through a wide valley. Since the weather was nice, I had my windows rolled down. As I passed the entrance of an old logging road, that familiar smell of sweet rot suddenly filled my car. Not just a whiff. A cloud of it filled the cab as if there was a week-old human corpse sitting in the front seat next to me. It was all too familiar, but this time, there was something else that I couldn't quite place. It lingered for a few moments, then went out just as quickly as it had entered. Realizing what I had just smelled, my heart sank, and I pulled to the side of the road. I told myself that it was just a dead animal in the ditch, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned my car around and drove slowly back toward the logging road. The closer I got to it, the smell became stronger, and I grew more certain that I was indeed about to find a body. Holding on to a shred of hope that I was wrong, I parked my unit on the side of the highway just before the dirt road. I radioed to dispatch, told them my location, and that I would be out of my unit for a moment. I didn't say why to avoid an awkward disregard on a possible body on the side of the road. I shined my flashlight into the ditch and into the encroaching briars and weeds as I walked closer to where I believed the source of the smell was. Once I was a few yards away from the dirt road, I saw the opening of a concrete culvert going under the highway. At this point, the smell was nearly as strong as it was when I had first passed. The opening of the culvert was about 3 feet in diameter, just large enough to hide a body inside. I cursed and held my breath as I leaned over and shined my light in there. It was just an empty tunnel stretching the width of the highway. Somewhat relieved, I stood and looked around. It smelled as if I was standing on top of whatever was emitting the odor. I searched around the brush for a moment, but found nothing. Thinking the origin might be on the opposite side of the highway, I crossed to the other ditch to continue searching. As I walked away from the other side of the road, the smell grew faint. I stopped at the opposite end of the culvert and peeked inside just to double check. The odor was nearly gone at this point. I stood up and checked my surroundings when I heard a crack in the bush behind me, and the smell engulfed me and was even stronger than before. Thinking for a moment that the wind must have shifted, I froze when I realized that the air was dead still. Whether it was fear or something else, a shiver went down my spine. In the distance, I saw headlights coming down the highway. As the car came near, the odor seemed to move away further into the bushes toward where I had heard the crack. The car stopped, and the passenger rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. I lied and told him that I was. I thanked him for checking, and walked briskly back to my car as they drove away. Then I got the heck away from there. Once I was able to get cell service, I called my friend who was patrolling the opposite side of the county. I explained what had happened, trying not to let on that I was spooked. Once I was done, he paused for a moment, then asked about the unusual hint of something which accompanied the smell. He asked if it was sulfur, and I put two and two together. It was sulfur that I had smelled. I asked if he thought that I had found a demon in the middle of nowhere, to which he simply responded with a concerned yes. A little background on this guy. He is the son of a missionary and has been around the world. He has seen, rather smelled this before, and told me that it was a very concerning experience. This spooked me even more because his responses were very out of character for him. There's always the chance of a very scientific explanation, and I hope that one is out there. To begin with, I should explain some basic personal history. Real names will not be revealed, obviously. I have a family of 5 plus 2 spouses. My parents, my 2 brothers, my oldest brother's wife, and mine. Before getting married and moving out with my wife, I lived in the same house for 19 years. My parents bought it when I was like 6 months old, and I got married during college, so I've only ever known that house and my current apartment. I had some traumatic experiences when I was very young that are tied to one of the rooms in my parents' house, and then a few years later, my parents had me move into that room. During my time in that room, I started having vicious nightmares, all involving me watching helplessly as the people that I loved were brutally murdered in graphic and creative ways, in which one constant fixture was a figure that seemed to be observing everything and watching me from a distance, never directly interacting with the chaos, but always on the edge of my vision. This figure always looked the same. A tall mass of complete opaque blackness, with the exception of an antlered animal skull where its head should be. Anyway, when I went to college, moving out of that room, the nightmares stopped completely. I didn't have a single one until I came home for winter break and stayed in that room again. During that break, my then fiancé stayed a few nights at my house with me. We slept in separate rooms, but both on the same floor. During the night, she texted me that she was having a panic attack and that she thought she was seeing a figure. When I asked what it looked like, she described the figure from my dreams exactly, and I told her to start reading Psalms in the hopes that it might help. She immediately felt better. Not sure if it was because of the scripture itself or if it was just a placebo, but I am a firm Christian, so I believe that it helped. We talked for a while about it before deciding to keep an eye out for more spooky shit. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. The next morning, I felt numb and out of commission, and I didn't fully recover until the next day. Every time I've gone back to that house since, I have felt an overwhelming, malicious presence there. It has the effect of weighing down on everything. It kind of feels like cotton in your ears, and making everything feel super depressing. Recently there was another development. My grandfather passed away this last semester, and my grandmother moved into the house with my parents. She's a troubled person, and she brought a lot of toxicity and conflict to the home. Last time I was there with my wife, we immediately felt something horrifyingly evil. I've always had a sensitivity to spiritual things, and it was like nothing that I have felt before. I think that it was feeding off of the conflict in the house and making things worse. My cat, who we had brought with us, immediately slipped into what looked like a super depressive state. She wouldn't play or do anything, no matter how hard we tried. The kicker was the time that I decided to try something. I walked into my old room, the one tied to my traumatic experiences, and tried to feel for any sort of extra bad energy. It was tangible. My mom and I had repainted that room the last time I was down there, and it felt very cathartic, but the power was still ever present. On an instinct, I touched a wall in the room and immediately had violent visions reliving my trauma, except the spirit was there, watching and seemingly gloating. It felt like it was trying to rub what had happened in my face like a "look what I'm capable of" sort of thing. My wife told me that I went white as a sheet and began shaking and crying, but I don't remember it. It behooves me here to add that I have seen several therapists about my traumatic experience. I don't think it was a PTSD flashback, as I've mostly worked through everything and am pretty mentally stable now. I'm relatively certain that the presence in my childhood home is evil, even demonic. I've talked to my mom, and I get the sense that she doesn't really believe me, but my wife and I are pretty certain of it. It all started when I was 5 or 6 years old and had an imaginary friend called Bombo. He was a small Victorian boy who lived with his mother, who I said lived under the floorboards, in the house that I grew up in. I used to talk and play with him all the time, teaching him about things like my Velcro shoes and some of the toys that I had. It was no secret to my family who Bombo was, and even what he looked like, or at least from how I had described him. One day my sister, who was 14 years old at the time, went back upstairs to our shared room after a family day out, and saw him standing in the corner of the room staring at her. He was exactly how I had described him, even down to the detail of his clothes. A few years passed, and I was now 10 or 11 years old. Our family had moved house a couple of times, and now lived in a 3-story house in a village just outside my hometown. I always had a weird feeling about that house from the moment we moved in, but didn't think much of it over the excitement of having my own room on the top floor that had a skylight. After a few months, things started to get strange. My things would disappear, I would hear footsteps on the middle floor landing at night, etc. These experiences progressively ended up getting stranger, with sounds like nails being dragged up the railings on the top floor getting worse and worse, as well as some nights my little sister, who was 3 at the time, screaming, saying that there was a man growling at her in her room, although my family put that down to an overactive imagination and didn't really think anything else of it. It was quiet for a couple of months, before everything came back again. This time, it was much worse. This was the first time I saw it. One night I was in my room watching TV and getting things ready for school the next day. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a face peering in at me through my skylight. Its skin was dark, and its eyes were white with no pupils, only veins, dark circles around its eyes leading to black cracks across its face. It was grinning at me, and even without pupils, I knew that it had its eyes locked on me. Needless to say that after a few seconds of initial shock, I ran downstairs to the rest of my family and refused to go back into my room. Shortly after this, my older sister, who had given birth recently and was living with us temporarily, had her own experience. As she was sleeping one night, she heard a knock on her door between 2 and 3 a.m. Thinking I was the one knocking, she shouted, "What?" twice, with no response. The door flung open after a few seconds with such force that the dresser had dented the door from the impact. No one was there. Shortly afterwards, we moved again for personal reasons to the house that we have now been in for years. 4 years, there was no unusual experiences other than the occasional sound of footsteps. Nothing that could be logically explained. When I was 18, my sleep schedule was the same as any teenager, waking up around noon and going to bed around 3 to 4 a.m. This one night in particular, I was up doing the same as always, listening to music, watching films, etc. At midnight, I went downstairs to the kitchen as usual to get some snacks. On my way back out of the kitchen, I saw it again. It was standing behind the front door looking in through one of the glass panels. It was the same face that I saw all those years ago. Same skin, same eyes, same dark circles and cracking features. It was staring right at me, this time with one of its hands leaning on the other glass panel as it watched me. The only difference was that this time it wasn't grinning. After standing there for what felt like an eternity, I ran as fast as I could up to my room and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Some family friends who were regular churchgoers theorized after they heard what I saw that this thing that I saw was Bombo, or what had taken the form of him in the first place, and that when I had stopped giving him my attention and energy, he had then tried to use another way of getting my attention. I don't know what to think for sure. All I know is that what I saw was the exact same thing that I saw as a child, and it came back. It's been 4 years since the last time I saw it, and I hope I never see it again. I live in a small town, and things like rumors tend to spread pretty quickly since folks around here are incredibly nosy beings. The most trusted source of these rumors is the local bar located in the center of the small settlement that we live in, which my father visits frequently. It is right by the school that I go to. Anyway, 2 weeks before all this bullcrap started, he came back with quite the story. It is said that something off has been going on with our town's graveyard, which is right by these creepy old woods a little bit away from the town itself. Usually takes 20 minutes to get there by car. Apparently, drunkards there claim that there's a medium disguised as a homeless man hanging around the woods surrounding the graveyard, and that sometimes he can even be found by the graves eating bread. At first, I didn't believe it, so me and my friend decided to walk to the graveyard and hang around there trying to find that guy. So we did, and the graveyard was full of people for a few hours, but the normal kind of people. A few more hours passed, and soon there was no one left except for an old, bearded man on the bench by the football field across the woods in the parking lot. He was looking at empty plastic bags with a box of cigarettes resting beside him. Nothing suspicious. My friend had the guts to walk up to him and insult him. I walked away from her, but when she crossed the line, I pulled her away, telling her that he may be a serial killer or a crazy drug addict. But he remained quiet until she yanked her hand away from mine, grabbed his box of cigarettes, and crushed it under her feet. She also threatened to hurt him if he didn't speak, and that's when he stood up and looked her dead in the eyes, and he was much taller than her too. He told her something along the lines of, "You are a disgrace in the eyes of God," and walked away onto the road until we lost track of him. I started to worry, and told her that maybe he was a priest or a monk, and now was going to tell everyone in our town how she had mocked him, and I was actually afraid. She reassured me that he was none of these things, because he had cigarettes with him, but I think those weren't even his. That night I slept over at her house because I was scared to go back to mine alone. I woke up in the middle of the night, and since I was sleeping in the same bed with her, I had a clear view of the pitch-black shadow of a man standing over her right beside her bed, his palm on her wrist. I raised my body, getting ready to stand up, but he turned his head to me and started to shake it from left to right. So I figured it was a lucid dream and rolled over to the other side, drifting back to sleep. The next morning, she looked pale and ghostly, and I asked her if she got enough rest. She informed me that she did not even sleep and kept having problems with her breathing and her heartbeat. I was so scared that I almost pissed myself right there and then, and as of now, I am home alone and feeling like I am being watched. In October of 2018, I was hospitalized for 4 nights. I was put in the surgical wing due to lack of beds, and was in a 4-person room with all rooms near me having 4 people as well. The last night of my stay was on the 31st, which of course was Halloween. Other than it being noisy from the firecrackers outside, followed by the heavy rain, it was uneventful. I was particularly restless that night and not having an easy time falling asleep. Just before midnight, and I remember looking at the clock seeing 11:47 because I couldn't fall asleep. I saw a figure in the window next to my bed. It was a massive black dog, like a long-haired husky with the reddest eyes that I have ever seen. It was such a deep, but at the same time bright crimson. It was just staring at me, and I felt completely frozen. I turned over and covered my face, and when I looked over some time later, it was gone. I should note that I was on an upper floor with a roof landing outside my window, so no way could an animal have gotten up there. I ignored it, called the nurse, and asked for something to help me sleep. They told me I didn't need anything and would eventually sleep on my own. About half an hour later, I saw the same creature staring at me from inside a window within the hospital across from mine. I immediately felt sick and panicked, and as quick as I saw it, it was gone. Several minutes later, my wing went on lockdown. The doors all closed, and all I could hear were screams and nurses running. The screams and panic went on for 4 hours. I found out the next morning that a pregnant woman in the room next to mine had died from an adverse reaction to the medication that she had been given. She went into complete psychosis, and at one point was running through the halls, banging on everyone's doors, begging for help, and telling us that the nurses were trying to kill her. I will never get those sounds out of my head. I had no idea what hellhounds were until I got home and searched. For what I had seen. I've let it lay dormant in my brain since then, but recently I've been having dreams where they show up, and it's terrifying. I'm so lost as to what to make of it, and terrified to make any assumptions. So I don't know how many people really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, or in people who say that they can see them. I would never say that I'm some professional psychic or medium. I'm not. I just know that I've always been able to see things that other people couldn't, hear things other people couldn't, and knew things that other people didn't. Pretty much my whole life. I felt like a freak and a weirdo for a long time until I just realized this is happening and it isn't going away, so I needed to accept it. I got help from professional mediums and the woo-woo community, and it helped. Backstory, but important. I was laying in bed in my room a couple years ago, trying to fall asleep. It was a long hallway, and my sister's room was at the end, and so was my mom's. My sister had a friend over who was dealing with an abusive boyfriend, and they were drinking and talking about it. This will also be important. You know how you get that feeling that someone's watching you? Or that feeling in a store when you just know that someone has stepped into your space? You don't have to look, you just know. That's what I felt. I looked up, and there's some girl with just her head poked into my room sideways. I just saw her head sideways, leaning past my door frame. She looked shorter, maybe 20s, with long black hair, kind of like the girl from The Ring. I'm looking at her wondering what she wanted, and she started to smile. Slowly, her eyes got huge and black, and her jaw unhinged into this giant, sick, pitch-black grin. Ice cold slammed into the pit of my stomach as I just stared at her for what felt like hours, frozen in fear, before what I'd been taught kicked in, and I made her leave. She instantly turned back to normal and skipped off down my hallway toward my sister's room. I thought, oh, is it my sister's friend? Depression and abuse and all those bad situations can really attract those types of beings, so I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward to literally last night. It's been years. My parents got divorced, which is a whole other post of creepy shit. I realized it wasn't just my dad who was the narcissist. It's absolutely my mom, too. They were a toxic pair, and currently, I'm in a situation where I have to live with my mom. It's fine, it's free. I'll be grateful and deal with it. Last night, I'm laying in my bed watching TV, minding my own business. Suddenly, I feel that feeling again. It's always the same feeling regardless of what type of ghosty it is. For me, anyways. I look at my door, and it's the exact same girl. I asked her what she was doing here, and she didn't respond. She just started smiling. Only this time her eyes went white, and her mouth grew into the same huge black grin, but she had tons of teeth like a shark. I get up to get my incense, which drives them out, and she runs in the direction of my mom's room. I go out into the hallway to look in that direction, and I see through my mom's cracked door this weird demon girl literally sitting crouched on top of my mom, staring at me. Almost like she was an animal claiming her prey. It was wild. I've never ever seen anything like that before. I also realized that this girl was never with my sister's friend. She was with my mom for however many years. But my mom's a crazy and very, very negative person regardless of what anyone does to help her. She loves drama and loves being a victim and loves complaining, so it's matching her energy, I guess. This ghost girl feels more like a bully than anything truly demonic. Like she had fun picking on people, which my mom absolutely does too. This ghost girl can't hurt me, she's just around, and man, it sure is scary when she is. She looks like an absolute demon, that's for sure. I've since seen other types of entities in her room at night while she slept, and have told her about it. She says I'm crazy at first, and then in the days that follow, she'll tell me how it feels dark. In 1996-97, I lived in a fairly old terraced house with a cemetery at the end of a road. Cliché, I know, but it's an important detail. Nothing remarkable about the house or the area, it was just convenient for college. Anyway, I was up late one night on the PC in my bedroom, which looked out onto the street. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. For whatever reason, probably to give my eyes a rest, I wandered over to the window and looked down at the road in the direction of the cemetery, although it was too far down the street for me to actually see. And I saw 3 people walking slowly down the road. I could see that they were quite old and appeared to be dressed in funeral clothes, which, given the hour, was weird. There were 2 women and a man. I'd put their ages at about 80, and the woman in the middle was being steadied or guided by the other woman and the man as they came closer. I got the impression that she was upset. My first thought was that given their age, she had recently buried her husband and grief had caused her to behave slightly irrationally. It was all interesting enough for me to carry on watching as they got closer to the house. Just outside the front door of the house was a street lamp. I continued to watch them as they made their way past, but when they got to the lamppost, they all stopped, and the upset woman in the middle looked up at me and grinned. This is where it got even weirder. The grin became a sort of grimace, and if there was any color in her face to start with, it was now dead white. At that point, I realized that I was staring right into her eyes, but her eyes were pitch black. If you've ever crashed a car, the final split second before you make impact seems to drag out as you process more information than normal in the time frame. It was that sort of scenario. I'm sure that we only made eye contact for a second, but it felt like several minutes as my peripheral vision faded, and I felt like all I could see were those two black holes in her face drawing me in. The distance between us didn't change, but somehow it felt like she was coming closer. At that point, the two people with her were just continuing to look down the road as if they were frozen, but waiting for this woman to finish with whatever she was doing. I was suddenly hit with this intense feeling of dread and panic, so I threw myself to the floor. As soon as I had broken away from her gaze, I felt pretty stupid that this upset old woman, who clearly needed help, had spooked me so badly. I looked out the window again, and there was no sign of them. I'm an actor at a haunted attraction in Pennsylvania. I was playing Jason on the hayride scene tonight. I hop up on the hayride and walk up and down the middle of it and scare people. This is my second year doing it, and I absolutely love this gig. But tonight, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was the second to last wagon of the evening. I was in the middle of the wagon, headed toward the front, when I got a really bad gut feeling that something was off. I got chills immediately and tried to hide the feeling of terror I had at that moment from customers. I turned my head, and to my left I saw a girl staring at me. She looked completely normal at first, until she blinked. In what seemed like hours, I saw her blink in slow motion, her eyes going from the sides and meeting at the middle. After the first blink, I saw her eyes turn completely black. She cracked a small smile while staring at me straight through my mask and into my soul. I heard her laugh inside my head. I was frozen for a moment, and she blinked again and she looked normal. My body unfroze, and I tried my best to finish the wagon. This was literally the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. What did I see? I am currently sitting in my bed at 12:35 in my time zone right now and was watching a YouTube video a couple minutes ago. Without warning, I suddenly hear a scream. My first thought was that it was part of my video, but I checked, and it was not. It sounded like it was from a man experiencing pure terror and agony. It was a single scream from the worst fear and pain imaginable.